Hi, I'm Rachel and welcome back to Auxhart Gardening. Today I want to teach you about Bokashi composting. Now before we get into the how of Bokashi composting, I want to talk about the why. There are a few different reasons that you might choose Bokashi composting over any other kind of composting. So the best thing about the Bokashi method, in my opinion, is that you can compost almost anything. You can compost things like meat, cooked foods, things with oils, dairy, almost anything you can compost with the Bokashi method. And I know that this is true of some other composting methods as well, but I think that the Bokashi method is the easiest and the most accessible way to be able to compost all the things. Additionally, it's really great if you're in a more urban environment like me where you don't have the room to set up a big compost pile. All you need is a bucket with a lid. It doesn't even have to be a 5-gallon bucket. If you want to get one of the smaller, like food grade buckets with a nice tight lid, that'll work as well. Some places will tell you that you need a fancy bucket or even a 2-bucket system to make Bokashi work. And maybe it might be nicer to have those things, but I don't think they're necessary. I've been doing Bokashi for a little while in just standard 5-gallon buckets, and maybe it's not the most convenient way, as you'll see as I get into a little bit more about this, but it definitely works. So if you're on a budget, this is the way to go. Another really cool thing about Bokashi is that it's so fast compared to other composting methods. You can go from scraps to compost in your garden in about a month. And I know that sounds crazy, and of course it depends on a few different factors. A month is probably about the fastest you could do it, but if you're cutting up all of your scraps and you're not putting things like bones into your compost, then you can have fully broken down compost around a month, maybe a month and a half, depending on your conditions. The Bokashi method is also a great way to improve the ecosystem in your soil. Since you're using specific bacteria to break down your compost, that's the Bokashi, then you're adding all of that beneficial bacteria that's breaking down food scraps into the soil ecosystem in your garden, which helps grow all sorts of other things that are beneficial and draws them into the area so that you can have really healthy soil, which of course makes for healthy plants. Let's talk about how Bokashi actually works. So Bokashi is an anaerobic process. That means it doesn't use any oxygen, where a bacteria called lactobacillus breaks down your food scraps and such, kind of in a fermentation in the bucket. Now, the bacteria that you'll buy generally comes kind of like this. Usually they'll use some sort of cheap grain or grain byproduct as a substrate. There's also a method to make your own at home that I'm currently trying with newspaper, and if that works out, you'll see a video on that come out. But the basic idea is that we're combining that bacteria with our food scraps in an anaerobic environment in order to ferment the food scraps into something that can then be broken down in the soil. The most common way you'll see people using Bokashi is they'll do a fermentation in the bucket, and then they'll move those half broken down food scraps out into the dirt and bury them, and then the rest of the breaking down happens there. Like I said, generally this process is around a month, month and a half, again, depending on what it is that you're putting in your specific bucket. But I've seen people go from food scraps to beautiful dirt in literally 4 weeks. And it's so easy to do. So let's get into what exactly you need to do to make your own Bokashi bucket. All right, so here is our bucket. The first step is to put a good layer of your Bokashi substrate on the bottom of your bucket. Make sure the whole bottom is coated, and then we'll start layering in some of our compostables. So I've got some garden scraps that I'm going to layer in. You can put things like cardboard. Just make sure to tear it up. So we've got that going on. And the trick is every few inches in your bucket, you want to add another layer of your bokashi grain. As you go, make sure you're compressing everything, because remember, this bacteria really wants an anaerobic environment. That means no air whatsoever. Got some kitchen scraps, more kitchen scraps. And that's all I have to go in the bucket right now. And as you can see, the bucket is only about a third of the way full right now. But you can keep adding to your bucket over time. You just want to make sure that you compress out all of the air and then cover it very tightly. So what I've done is I made a little cardboard circle cutout to go in the top of my bucket. I'm going to use it to press out all of the air and then compress the food. And I'm going to take my actual plastic lid and put that on top and make sure it's sealed off nice and tight. So the basic idea is that you want to keep adding to this bucket until it's full. I recommend opening it as little as possible. If you can collect your scraps somewhere else and then maybe put them in the bucket once a day or once every other day so that you minimize the amount of air that you're letting in, that's ideal. Once you've filled the bucket all the way to the top, make sure it's compressed as much as you can. Again, you don't want any air in between the layers. You'll seal it up real good, and then you'll let it ferment for somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks. You can let it go longer if you want, but minimum 1 week. Probably gonna want to go for 2 weeks with a big 5-gallon bucket like this. And then when you're done with that first fermentation, you'll take it out into your garden, bury it, and then you'll have to wait at least 1 more week before you then plant something there. Now, if you happen to have a ready bucket of bokashi but no garden space to bury it in, you can always add it to a traditional compost pile if you've got one of those. Now, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that a lot of places will try and sell you a specific bokashi bucket. And usually these buckets have a little spigot at the bottom to let liquid out. So if you're taking a lot of time to fill your bokashi bucket, say you're like me and you don't have that many food scraps, it might take you like a month to fill up a bucket this size. And over that time, the stuff in the bottom layer is already starting to break down, and that releases liquid. And we don't necessarily want the bokashi sitting in that liquid. But the easy fix for that is really just to take a turkey baster. Most people have a turkey baster. If you don't, you can get it on Amazon for like $6. Just take a turkey baster and suck out that liquid. And that liquid is also very useful in your garden. You should dilute that liquid pretty heavily. Most places don't give a specific dilution ratio, but I generally would put about 1 turkey baster's worth into a gallon of water. And then you can use that to fertilize your garden. Now, I said earlier that with bokashi you can compost almost anything, right? So let's talk about the things that you absolutely cannot put into your bokashi. They include things that were never alive, such as plastic, metal, things like that. They also include things that already have microorganisms growing on them, bacteria or mold. So never throw anything that you've let go moldy into your bokashi bucket. And the reason for that is that you don't want that new foreign microorganism to outcompete the bokashi. Because remember, bokashi is a bacteria too. And we want the good bacteria to win. And if there's just trace amounts, which there always will be, then the bokashi will win out because there's a lot more of it. But if you introduce something with a hunk of mold on it, then chances are that that could outcompete your bokashi and you would end up with a rotting mess inside of your bucket. Things that I have put in my Bokashi bucket over the last few months include those cardboard egg cartons, pieces of junk mail paper that I've shredded up, of course all the normal stuff like vegetable scraps, eggshells. I've put weeds from the garden into my bucket, and also my cat has a habit of bringing me dead mice. Those go in the bucket. They've broken down pretty well so far. I've put raw chicken scraps in here. I've put cooked vegetables, like the scraps from that, in here, even though they have oil on them. All of that's going to break down. So really, I think Bokashi is one of the most inclusive composting methods that you can use, and it's also one of the easiest composting methods to use, in my opinion. And lastly, before we go, I want to talk about ways that you can tell if your Bokashi is actually working right. So thing number one is, after you've let it ferment for a week or two, you should open it and see kind of little white fuzz all over everything. That is a very good sign that your Bokashi is working. The second thing that you should look for is the smell. It should smell fruity and like a little bit like decomposition, but if you've ever like smelled something that's rotting, or maybe a compost pile that wasn't cared for properly, and it just like the smell hits you in the face and it's like really nasty, that is not a good sign. You want it to be kind of musky and a little bit decomposition-y. Sometimes it'll be a little fruity, but it shouldn't smell like rot. If it does smell like rot, then what's probably happened is you haven't gotten enough air out of everything, because the things that cause that rotting smell are generally aerobic processes, things that need that oxygen to happen. And so as long as you're keeping your process anaerobic, sealed off from the air, you shouldn't have any problems with that. If you have any questions about getting started with your Bokashi, please leave them in the comments below. Chances are I forgot some little detail, but that's okay. I'm sure y'all will remind me in the comments. And if you like this video, please click the like button and please subscribe, because it really helps out my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I wish you all happy gardening.